Do you know how easy it is to make these for yourself? This is a store-bought picture frame and it is trash. The joints are failing, it's made from a really low quality wood and, well, it's a waste of a decent chunk of money. You don't need to be an expert to make your own frames that are cheaper, nicer and stronger than this. In fact, I'm going to prove that anyone can make them. I'm going to cover every step, every choice and give you the information you need to ensure you're confident enough to make your own frames. No overwhelming expert level details, no fluff and no confidence breaking jargon. Only the basics. So let's get started. Breaking down any build into a series of individual parts is always the easiest way to start. And a picture frame is no different. You've got two vertical stiles and two horizontal rails, and where they meet, you've got your joinery. In this case, we've got miter joints. I'm going to cover all joinery options a little bit later, how to cut them and of course the pros and cons. If we look at the back, we can see that each side needs a rebate. This rebate is going to hold the entire contents of the frame itself. As far as contents go, you've got glass or clear acrylic. You've got mat board, which is used to create a border and to hold the artwork away from the glass itself. Then you've got the artwork. And finally, a mounting or backer board. There's a little bit of hardware, pins or clips hold everything tight into the frame, and then hanging hardware keeps the frame on the wall. So let's get rid of this and talk about the different techniques and options that are available to you. And at the end, we'll look at the cost to buy against the cost to make, along with how to avoid and fix any of the mistakes you might make along the way. And so like any build, the first job is to measure and then plan. Don't make a frame without knowing exactly what's going to go in it. Either take the photo or the piece of art that you want to frame and then build your frame custom fit around it. Mine is a wedding photo. And I'm going to use this pre-cut mat board as a border to keep everything nice and neat. You can buy this mat board in large sheets, different colours, and then you just cut it to size, cut the outline out using a Stanley knife, or you can get a specialist tool that leaves a really nice bevel around the cut itself. And you don't even need one of these borders, but it does serve a second purpose of keeping the photograph away from the actual glass itself. And now I can take my measurements from the border itself, but it's worth noting here to add a tiny bit of leeway in. How much leeway really depends on how confident you are with your skill levels and how dialed in your tools are. I'm certainly no expert, but my tools are pretty well dialed in, so I'm going to add around 2mm to either side before I make any cuts. That means as the frame itself is 700mm by 498, I'm going to be aiming to fit in a piece that would be 704mm by 502mm. And here now is a really early mistake that you can avoid. This measurement that we're cutting to is not to the inner part of the frame here, because everything is going to sit inside the rebate. So actually the measurement itself is to the furthest points of the rebate, from side to side and from side to side. But you don't need to stress about any of that right now. I'm going to show you how easy it is when we get to it. Now, before we do any cutting, we've got to make our wood choices. And as this is only the basics video, let's keep this simple. You can use anything you have or you can get. If you want to show off the wood or make it a feature, then I suggest going for hardwood, but it will cost you more. Sapele for dark and oak for light are my normal go-to choices. But we can save money. For instance, if you're going to hide wood behind stain or paint, then go cheap. Like this pine, for instance, that I'm going to be using for some of the builds today. This is just from an old bed. But just know if you do that, pine is incredibly soft and can dent really easily. Whereas wood like poplar or other cheaper hardwoods take paint really well. But honestly, there's nothing stopping you starting out with MDF, plywood or even pallet wood for this. Starting to build is really what's important. And I really believe it's worth mentioning at this point that if you don't have the larger tools to do your own milling in your workshop, there are sites online where you can buy the timber ready cut and planed on all sides. And what that means is when you order it and then receive it, you're going to get wood that is at the right dimension with all four sides square to each other. And please don't feel like you aren't doing woodworking properly if you order wood like this. This is not cheating. All it is taking into account your particular setup and working with it. And that's absolutely fine. So now we've got our wood picked out and each piece is milled to the correct depth and width for the frame. Now we need to talk joinery. Now I guess 95% of the frames you're going to see are going to be joined using a miter joint. And if I'm honest, that's my preferred method too. But there are easier joints and multiple ways of cutting them. So let's go through them. First, there's the butt joint. Just two frame pieces joined end to side to make a 90-degree angle. You could go shaker style or you could go for something a little bit fancier. Then there's the half lap joint. This looks like a butt joint, but each piece overlaps the other by half the thickness to add more glue area and therefore more strength. Next, the miter joint, as we've discussed, two 45-degree angles meeting at the corner to give you a 90-degree overall angle. And while we're listing, there's the mortise and tenon joint. Kind of like what you might see on your cupboard doors at home. One piece has a mortise cut into it and the other piece a tenon, so that they join together nicely. But honestly, I'm going to leave this to one side because it is way too much work for a simple picture frame. So let's do the pros and cons for the three that are remaining. Butt joints. They are weak, but they're easy to cut and incredibly beginner friendly. Miter joints. Once again, very weak due to the end grain to end grain glue up, but they look clean, very professional and easy on the eye. But importantly, both of those weak joints can be strengthened relatively easily, and we'll get to that soon. Half laps. They look like a butt joint, but they're overlapping. And it's that overlapping that increases the glue to glue surface and makes them incredibly strong. So there's no need to go down the reinforcement route. But like the mortise and tenon joint before, they're a significant amount more work than the butt joint. So we're going to leave these to one side as well. And trust me, the butt joint, once we've done the reinforcement to it, is not only quicker and easier, but it's also strong enough. So now we're just left with two choices for our joinery. But before we can start going into how to cut that joinery, first I need to show you how to cut the rebates to hold your pictures in place. So for the frames we're going to make today, we're going to be having a thinner front with a deeper side. And the next job we need to look at is cutting the rebate for the art, the backerboard and the glass to sit in. The first thing you need to consider is how thick are the contents that are going to be inside the frame. And this is going to determine the minimum depth that the rebate needs to be. And just to explain that a little bit better, here's your rebate. When I say minimum depth, you need the thickness of your contents, but you also need to leave a little bit of room to put your clips in to hold that content in place. And behind those clips needs to be just enough wood so the clips don't pop out. That's your true minimum depth of rebate. Then the next consideration is how much depth of the frame do you actually want left? Because not only does this have to be considered aesthetically, but it also has to be considered for strength purposes. Personally, if you're going to make these, I would say you need a minimum of 5mm left over at the front edge of the rebate. But it is a fine line because if you leave too much, you could end up with shadows being cast over your work depending on which wall it's going to be sat on. But don't worry, if you want to leave more than 5mm or you can't cut a rebate that deep, simply bevel the edge on all sides and that will alleviate the shadows. This is the beauty of making your own frames. Now the width of the rebate, or how far it goes into the frame itself, is really dealer's choice, but I would suggest cutting it to around about 1/3 of the thickness of the frame itself. That way you've got enough to house the contents, but you're still leaving enough strength in the frame. And remember we measured our border that's going to determine the distance from rebate to rebate? Well, luckily if you're going to cut your rebates before doing the joinery, that measurement has no reflection on how deep your rebates need to be. You can actually adjust the length of the frame to ensure that you're hitting your measurements right. Let me explain that in a little bit more depth with the two joinery methods that we're using though, because each one has slight nuances. But as I'm making this video, I've had a bit of a brainwave. And towards the end, I'm going to give it a bit of a test. I think I can show you how to make both of these types of frames without ever having to cut a rebate. And let's be honest, for beginners with limited tools, I think that's going to be a game changer if we can pull it off. But just for now, let's assume that you do have enough tools and you can cut a rebate. First, we're going to take the miter joint. One of the best features of this joint is that if you cut the rebate before construction, when the joint is put together, it hides the rebate. This makes hitting your measurements far, far easier. So let's cut our rebates first. And the first option for doing this is the table saw. Now this isn't going to be a through cut, so for that we're going to have to remove the crown guard. And from a safety standpoint, that has to be taken into account. But even after taking away one of the key safety features of the table saw, I still think this is the best option. But please, do your research and decide for yourself. The way I cut a rebate on a table saw is simple. You just make one cut to the depth you require, then you turn the piece through 90 degrees and then you make a second cut. Remember each time that the height of the blade and the distance from the fence will both play a part in how accurate your cuts are. And when you've made both cuts, you remove a strip of wood. And this creates the rebate. And for the best results, don't change the fence between each cut for each piece of wood. Do the first cut on all 4 frame pieces and then change the blade and do the second cut across the 4 pieces again. Now one of the biggest bonuses with the table saw is that it is much cleaner than using a router. But I will show you the router table method too. And just know, you could also do this with a handheld trim router too. All you need to do is take multiple shallow passes using either a straight bit like I'm using here or a bearinged rebate bit. Gradually pass deeper until you've got the rebate cut. And then we always have to talk about option 3, and that's using hand tools. This is my Stanley plough plane. And it's worth saying at this point, with hand tools, I'm certainly no expert. But with some practice and patience, this is the quietest and cheapest method of getting the job done. And as you can see from the footage, it's really seriously satisfying. So pick the tool that suits you best. And as you learn more skills, that tool may change. We are all constantly learning, and one major resource of that learning for me is the sponsor of this week's video, Woodworkers Guild of America. Let's talk first about the deal. The first 1,000 of you that click on the link down below in the description will get a full year premium membership to Woodworkers Guild of America for only $1.49. This offer is only valid for new members, but it is a great deal. You see, Woodworkers Guild of America is an online community of knowledgeable, like-minded woodworkers, a place where members can learn and advance new skills while discovering new projects. From beginner to masters of the craft, there are step-by-step instructional videos taught by experienced, friendly instructors, all sharing their professional techniques. I recently clicked on one of the trending videos to learn about cabinet building, and I found that one of my favourite YouTubers, Jimmy DeResta, had collaborated on the content. From there, I decided to take a deep dive into all things cabinet making. Whether you're looking at finishing techniques like this video on how to apply shellac, or in the glue up section, something about bent lamination. With thousands of high quality videos available, all easy to browse, you will find inspiration and learning on every page. So remember, the first 1,000 of you new to Woodworkers Guild of America who click on the link down below or in the description will get a full year's premium membership for only $1.49. And thank you Woodworkers Guild of America for sponsoring this video. Now let's take a look at cutting a rebate in that butt jointed frame. Now with the butt joint, it is much harder to cut the rebate first. Because if you run a rebate the entire length of the picture frame, when you put the butt joint together, it's going to show at the end. So you've got two options. You can either use your router table with some markers and stops set up to run a partial rebate, or like this one, you can glue everything together and then use a trim router with a rebate bit and a bearing to cut the rebate after construction. One thing to note with the bearing bit is you will have to then go back in with a chisel to square out the corners. And again, remember, lots of shallow passes with the router and go in the right direction, so you're going against the spin to keep control of the tool. This is going to take a little bit more maths to work out the depth of the rebate and then work it back to the length that you need to cut the frame to start with. But it is very doable, and as I'm going to show you shortly, if you don't have the larger tools, it is still the easiest to cut joinery. Though I have to say it is a big win for the miter joint in terms of workload and margin for error. So, I mentioned that you've got to cut your butt joints before you do the rebates. Let's talk about cutting methods for all of these frames. Now, I said before, the reason that I've left the butt joint in this equation is because of its greatest strength, simplicity. For a beginner, they're just going to feel easy to cut. Tool-wise, you could use a miter saw, a table saw with a miter gauge or a sled. You could use your circular saw with a speed square, or a hand saw with either a bench hook or a miter box. They're all going to get the job done. But what's really important here is that every single cut you make is not only square across the width, but it's also square across the depth. And obviously with a miter saw or a table saw, this all comes down to how well you've dialed in the saw itself. Once it's dialed in, all your cuts should be 90 degrees and square. Now with hand cutting these, I have to confess, mine would certainly not be square, nor would they with the circular saw and the speed square, not in both directions. So for these, I would suggest learning how to build a shooting board so that you can use your hand plane to square off the ends. Not to mention, you could also use this to dial in the length of the pieces, taking a few millimeters off here and there. Because the other vital element of this is ensuring that opposing sides are identical in length. And finally, that the edges, where the butt joint meets, are also square. If you get square cuts, square sides, and matching lengths, your frame will be square. And the same can be said for a miter joint, but I think it's actually cutting the joints that tends to put people off. I mean, it's true that you can cut a 45-degree angle for these with a handsaw and then square it off with a shooting board. The only difference being that you need to adapt your shooting board just slightly so it works the 45-degree angle. But I'm going to say overall, cutting these by hand is not going to be all that beginner friendly. And if you don't have a miter saw or a table saw, I'd suggest sticking to the butt joints for now. For my miter joints, well, I cut those on a table saw using my miter gauge. But you could make a fancy sled with 45-degree battens attached to it. I mean, I would certainly recommend that if you're going to be making multiple frames. But if you're only going to be making 2 or 3 and your miter gauge is well dialed in, that'll work perfectly fine. And by dialed in, I mean that your miter gauge is perfectly 45 degrees to the blade of the table saw. But not only that, the table saw blade needs to be 90 degrees to the tabletop of your table saw, not to the throat plate. So if you can cut butt joints and miter joints perfectly well, then in my opinion, miter joints are the way to go. So now let's take our rebated pieces over to the table saw so we can cut our miters. And I'm going to show you how to sneak up on the perfect fit to the measurements that we did earlier. Ensuring, of course, that you're measuring from the right place in the rebate from one end to the other and allowing that 2mm of leeway. What I tend to do here is make the first cut at the furthest end of your piece so you're saving as much wood as possible. Then I'll take that piece over to the frame around the artwork, which is, as we know, the final dimensions, and then I'll take a referential measurement from that itself, leaving again a couple of millimeters for leeway. Then with the markings I made, I can go back over to the table saw, flip the piece, ensuring that you are getting an opposing angle on the other end. Trust me, you won't get this right every time. There will come a time where you've got parallel angles and you wonder how that happened. Now take your second cut, leaving a generous amount of room up to your line, and then just sneak up on a fit. I actually like to bring the frame piece in just to double check my first line and to do another referential measurement. And I just sneak up until I'm happy. And that is now one perfect size. For its opposing side, don't even bother measuring. Just cut one identical to this. And the simplest way to do it is just to line up the first cut you've made on the second piece and mark off with a generous amount of leeway where you're going to make the second one, and then cut it a little long, and then keep bringing it back, comparing it with the first piece, and shave off a bit every time. All of this is sneaking up on a fit, and I will cut both pairs the same way, and that will leave me with a perfectly square frame at exactly the right dimensions. Well, that's the frame cut. Now you're ready for a dry fit. And all a dry fit is something you should do on every single build. It's a no glue fit together to see that everything's square. And as you'd expect, the butt joint frame is super easy to do. Use F-clamps, parallel clamps, squeeze clamps, and then basically check it square. With the miter frame, it's a little different. Technically, you can use an F-clamp or a squeeze clamp, but due to the angle that the joint meets itself, if you put pressure unevenly, you're just going to move all of the sides out of alignment. It's far better to get a specialist clamp for this job. And to keep everything together, apply a little bit of painter's tape or blue tape. Just lie the frame flat against a straight edge and apply the blue tape to the back of each of the joints. When it's closed, the tape's going to stretch a little and hold the outer part of the miter tight together. Then once you've got the blue tape in place, you can apply clamping pressure, and then you've got two options. Option number one is a ratchet clamp or a strap clamp. They don't have to be pricey. In fact, this one was about £7. It was actually the cheapest I could find. You simply wrap it around and then tighten. And what this clamp does is it tightens on each of the corners, pulling your joints closer together. Option two is these spring clamps. These are also very good, but you have to put up with a few tiny holes in the corner of your work. But overall, I use the strap ratchet clamps for all of my frames. And then while everything's dry fit, just check everything's square by measuring the diagonals and comparing them together. And if you're happy with that, then it's time to glue. Now, some of you may be busy shouting at the screen right now, why haven't you sanded the inside of your frame? Because before you glue it, this inside section is much easier to sand than after you've glued everything together, especially the corners. My theory on this is if you are confident that you can sand that entire inside edge without rounding down the areas where it's going to meet the miter, which is where your sander could fall off it, as it were, and just round that edge off, then go ahead, do it before the glue up. If you're not confident, then you're going to have less margin for error doing it after the glue up and just hand sanding into the corners to keep that crisp 90-degree angle. And it comes to this point that throughout this video I've said margin for error about 100 times and I'm using it wrong. Having a high margin for error is actually quite good. I'm using it backwards. When I say there's a high margin for error, I'm actually meaning that that's a bad thing and there's a high chance of error. Sorry about that. And there's one other preparation step I want to do before we start gluing this together. All I'm going to do is put a little bit of painter's tape on the inside of this corner on both sides, because this is one of the areas that you're going to see and any squeeze out might be a little bit hard to get out of that corner. Tape it up and you can just peel the tape off once the glue up's done. Now, one little tip here before you put the actual glue on for your glue up is just to take a little bit of your wood glue and then mix in a little bit of water just to water it down. You're then going to apply this to all of the end grain for every joint. And what this does, in about 10 minutes, it's sealed up all of the fibres so that when you apply the actual glue for the glue up, it stops those fibres from sucking that glue out of the joint. And that just basically means there's less chance of your joint failing. And then once you've got them glued and clamped, you can leave them to cure for a couple of hours or overnight, and then we're nearly there. Now, I was going to leave this tip till the end when we do all the tips, but it seems appropriate here. Like any glue up, when you're applying clamps, don't over squeeze the joint. Because although you want to have a little bit of squeeze out so that you know you've got glue covering the entire joint, what you don't want to do is squeeze the entire glue out so there's none left in there to hold the actual joint together. I don't think you'll manage that with a ratchet clamp, but if you're using F-clamps on butt joints, a couple of extra twists too far could spoil your project. And now, with joints in mind, we have to combat these two joints' biggest weaknesses, and that's their lack of strength. Now, there are a number of solutions. Let's take the butt joint first. If you plan to paint the frame, then take the easiest method. And that's just a screw followed by a dowel plug or a countersunk screw with wood filler. Sand it flush and then paint. But if you want the frame to look clean as you're not painting it, then there are some alternatives. I mean, you could stick with screws and dowels and then just use a contrasting wood for the dowel that gives it a little bit of interest. Or you could just drill the dowel straight through, use a bit of glue and skip screws entirely. Or before construction, you can use dowels or a biscuit inside the joint itself. All work perfectly fine, but they do add in more complications than you actually need. Especially as we're talking only the basics here. I mean, the simplest of all could just be a simple pocket screw at the back of the frame. You'll never see it from the front and it adds plenty of strength. So honestly, if it was me for a butt joint, it would be pocket holes or the dowel straight through. And with a mitre joint, you could do all of the ones we've just said. Or like the professional frame makers do, just use some heavy duty staples at the back. But I think the two that are most commonly used for aesthetical reasons and strength are splines through the outside of the joint or keys at the back. Keys can be anything countersunk and glued across the joint, giving it extra strength from side grain to side grain bonding. You could drill a hole with a Forstner bit and glue in a disc, or like I've done here, route a channel across the back to fit a strip of contrasting wood. And it's worth noting the contrasting wood adds a nice feature to the outside too. But I have to say at this point, for my frames, 99% of the time, I use splines. Splines are simply slots cut in the outside of the mitre that you then fit with a spline made from a contrasting or similar wood type, depending how you want it to look. Gluing in the spline gives a lot of side grain to side grain glue area, giving it extra strength. But there is one thing to note, ensure that the grain direction of the spline goes across the joint, not with it. That way you'll ensure extra strength. Now, cutting the slot is where the skill lies, and there are a ton of different methods. If you have hand tools, you could use a handsaw and just cut the slot any size from one saw kerf up to around a third of the frame depth. Or, like I'm doing, you can use a router with a jig or a router table with a jig. And this will also allow you to experiment with different shaped splines. But it's equally easy to use a table saw with or without a jig. All of these are great options. Choose the one that gives you the best results and feels the safest. Because once you have the slots cut, you can then dial in the splines, add some glue, and then once they're cured a little bit, you can trim off the excess. And now what was a relatively weak joint on your frame is now really strong. And don't worry if you've run into a few issues at this point. I've had them too, so I've included some solutions to some of the common ones a little bit closer to the end. But let's talk finish first. So whatever it is that gets you through sanding, whether it's music or a podcast, strap your headphones on, get your sander out, and start working your way up through the grits. And remember, spending hours on any build is wasted if you rush your way through the finishing process. So just take your time and pay special attention to those corners. Because these orbital sanders tend to round out corners if you're not careful, because they have a little bit of a dip in the centre of the pad. So I use an orbital sander for the main bulk of the frame, but I'll use some sandpaper glue to a block of ply or one of these handy card sanders to just do the corners so I keep my edges nice and crisp and square. And lastly with sanding, try to sand evenly, because if you sand one edge more than the other, you'll notice that the corner itself moves off centre. If that happens to you, just sand the adjacent edge and it will bring it back to centre. And then just apply your finish. If you, like me, have made these from scraps of a little bit more unattractive wood, you can stain them, or better still, have a bit of fun and paint them. I've really dug down deep into my creative side and opted for black. I tried. But for some more attractive wood, the choice is absolutely yours. Lacquer if you want a shine, or oil or hard wax oil if you want a more satin finish. Personally, I prefer the latter on frames. And now you can add in the art. Although there is one final choice to make, and that's glazing. Personally, I prefer acrylic rather than glass. But for this particular frame, it just so happens that I've got some glass left over from that old frame that I showed you. But in normal cases, I do prefer acrylic because it's just less brittle. It's easier to store and it's easier to cut. But depending on your preference, either acrylic or glass can both be ordered online and cut to size. And in this particular case, the old frame that I took apart happened to have a backer board too. But normally I would just get some 3mm ply and use that. And just note, if you've got delicate art that you're mounting to that backer board, acid free is the way to go. And just to hold everything into place, we need to add in some nails or some pins. This picture frame point driver for me is an absolute game changer. If you ever plan on doing more than 4 or 5 frames, then this tool is a must. It makes the job so quick and easy, and the pins are really strong. And then finally, to hang the frame, I just add these D-rings and then tie some wire between them. But there are other hanging methods. And then you're done. But remember, I did promise to show you a technique that was the easiest of all for all beginners. And as a bonus for non-beginners, if you use the table saw to cut the rebates initially, then this is going to use up the scraps nicely. But with beginners in mind, if you take 2 battens of equal length, mine are the ones we removed for making the battens, glue these together into an L shape. If you use one of the straight edges on the battens to reference the glue line, then what we're going to be left with is exactly what we had earlier after cutting the rebates. And you haven't had to cut any rebates. If you can cut a 45-degree angle confidently, then simply do that and you've got a frame. But if you're starting out and you've managed to cut a 90-degree angle confidently, then just do that. But just know you'll have to dial in a block of wood to fill that gap. But even with that, I still think it'll look really nice. So I think part 1 of the conclusion for this video is actually this method is by far the easiest for people starting out making picture frames. But I do have to add a second part to it. If you have the tools and you feel confident using them, then the best joint, as you may expect, is the 45-degree mitre joint. The best way to cut your rebates is the table saw, so long as you're confident and feel safe doing so. And I would urge any beginner starting out to aim for that process as they learn. And the chances are that as you carry on building through your woodworking hobby, a table saw is going to become pretty much essential. But like anything, there's other ways of getting the job done. You could use a track saw with an MFT or a mitre saw. But as you build these frames, there are bound to be some common issues that we all face along the way. So let's quickly address them now. Firstly, mitre joints not meeting. It happens. If the gaps are huge, then you've probably got your angles slightly out. I would recalibrate my tools and then give it another shot. Small gaps can be filled with a sawdust and paste mix, or even wood filler. For tiny gaps, I would just squeeze a bit of glue in and then just sand some dust in. Gaps at the very end of the mitre joint, as long as they're not too big, can be closed with a little bit of glue and some burnishing. This is where you fold the fibres in to close the gap. And finally, my favourite, a little bit of frame twisting. This can happen if your clamps are slightly out of alignment. Simply pick up your hand plane, find the corners that are slightly raised, and then plane them down. If you've got a number 5 or larger with a nice long base on it, simply rotate round in circles and it will gradually lower the high spots. As long as the hand plane is supported around all of the corners, eventually this will level off the picture frame. Then flip it and do the same on the other side. In all honesty, this just takes practice and a well-tuned hand plane. A couple of random tips. This one is going to sound a little bit obvious, but if you're just starting off, getting used to your tools, start with a smaller frame rather than a larger frame first. The chance of error increases with the size of the frame. Mistakes are going to happen. I mean, don't aim for factory finish perfection. This one started off perfect, and now look at it. Make a frame that you like, in a style that you like, with a wood that you like, and then look back and be proud of what you've made. Replace older ones to save money on glass and backer boards. And a quick one on costs. This frame, when it was new, cost me £20. The frame that I should be replacing it with cost me £12 in wood, £10 in acrylic, and £3 in backer board. So it is a little bit pricier. And do note that I milled the wood from very rough to get it to this stage, and there's been wear and tear on the tools. It's approximately taken me a day to get it done. But I hope you agree that the difference is night and day. And honestly, that's part of what's important here. I don't think it's very often that making things for yourself works out cheaper than buying them from these massive home decor shops. But the customization, the quality, the look, well, you get it. But more important than that, the fun of the build and the pride that you can take every time you look at the photo or the artwork and then see your frame showing it off, that's the real win. And honestly, that's priceless. Give it a go. I hope this has helped you or inspired you to get into the workshop in the coming days. And if you do, I really hope that you enjoy whatever it is that you build. I know this video has been another long one with lots of details. I really thank you if you've got this far along. And if you've enjoyed it, well, there's a couple of similar ones up there. If you click, I'll see you over there.